What's up guys, Ruppy here with yet another draft analysis. I know, it's been a while since I've actually done anything with this channel and I do apologize, but trying to get things back in gear and trying to keep things on a consistent schedule for a change. Well, at least that's what I'm hoping to accomplish with this league, the SAPL. Do not ask me what the letters stand for. I'm afraid I can't tell you. I'm kind of blind to that myself. If anyone actually watches and wants to fill in the blank for me from the league, please feel free to do so. So anyway, the SAPL. You're probably looking at the... Sorry, my cat decides it wants to join in the recording session. Please just stay away from my cord, Slim. Anyway, sorry about that. So the SAPL. Basically... This league, in many ways, is kind of a carbon copy of the NPA, the National Pokemon Association. As you can probably tell by the draft tiers off to the side. We got one Tier 1 Pokemon, one Tier 2, two Tier 3s, a Tier 4, a Tier 5, 4 free picks, and an S tier for a total of 11 Mons. The S tier, there were basically a couple of the more extremely versatile / quote-unquote broken Mons, and all of the Mega Evolutions. The S tier was divided into 3 or 4 different tiers in and of itself, so if you didn't grab an S1, you had the chance of basically getting a few more points to be able to spend towards free picks if you so desired. Overall, I'm kind of on the fence about my team. I like what it's got, and it's a really solid team altogether, but it's definitely a team concept that I have never used before in draft format. So this is going to be quite interesting. So I honestly do not remember the actual order I drafted these Mons in, so I'm just going to go top to bottom, starting with my S tier pick, if that's alright with you guys. So, my S tier pick. There were a lot of things I could have gone with here. I do believe I actually took my S tier as my second pick, honestly. But I'm just going to go straight down the line. But, ultimately, I decided... I saw something there that a lot of the Mons that I would normally go for my first-ish pick, that are the more versatile threats, were kind of already off the board by the time my actual first pick came around. But... there is one Mon that stood out to me in the S tier that I really wanted to use. You can kind of blame A-Drive for this, but... my S tier pick ended up being Mega Beedrill, which I really can't argue with. Mega B is stupidly fast. It hits pretty hard, especially considering it gets adaptability after it Mega Evolves. So its stab attacks are a 2x multiplier as opposed to a 1.5x multiplier. This thing obviously can pivot out with U-turn, and a very hard stab U-turn at that. It gets Poison Jab, it can Drill Run, Knock Off, it can do a fair amount of things. But the main thing is, it's ridiculously fast, and it hits very hard, and there's very little that's going to outspeed it without needing a Choice Scarf. So... I can easily use this thing for scouting purposes and just hitting things really hard, just for the sake of hitting things hard, because really, who wants to stand across from this thing? I mean, look at it! I wouldn't want to get anywhere near this thing. Then again, I'm kind of afraid of bees, so that goes without saying, but anyway, moving on. My Tier 1 pick, I believe, was my actual first round pick, and as I said, by the time my actual first pick rolled around, a lot of the things I normally go for were well off the board. So I decided to try a Mon that is still fairly versatile in what it can do, and is also fairly threatening in its own right. And it actually forms a really solid U-turn core with Mega Beedrill, and helps kind of alleviate some of the pressure on trying to pick apart teams for my Mega Bee. And that is Landorus-Therian. I don't think it really needs to be said why Landorus-Therian is always a massive threat that needs to be watched out for in draft format. Even though it is primarily a physical attacker, this thing has a wide array of options that it can do, even within that scope. It can be Choice Scarf, you can Bandit, Obviously, it can set up Stealth Rocks, and it makes a fairly solid defensive mon, too, when you factor in Intimidate and the ground flying typing. You can run Swords Dance on it, you can run Rock Polish, which is very threatening. Obviously, since we're following NPA rules, that means I am free to use a Z Crystal on any mon, and I'm also not restricted to offensive Z moves. I can use status ones if I see fit. And, well, as long as they're not evasion boosting or omni boosting. So, I could easily toy around with a couple of Z Crystals for Landorus as well. Obviously, Flyinium Z, yeah, I think it's Flyinium Z, whatever. For Supersonic Sky Strike is definitely threatening, seeing this thing soaring through the air. Bizarre as that may be. Obviously I could go, the Ground EMZ as well. I got a number of different things I could toy around with. The next mon on the list, going down to my tier 2 pick, I kinda wanted to continue my Volturn core. But I basically decided I wanted to start actually drafting the actual, cores one would look at, Fire, Water, Grass, and Fairy Steel Dragon at this point, because I did not have one. And this thing actually does add more Volturn, because I think my team is pretty much, for the most part, best summed up as Volturn spam. And the next mon definitely helps out with that, especially from a relatively slower standpoint most of the time. That being Rotom-Wash. You can never go wrong with the giant washing machine, because Electric Water is actually a fairly solid typing. It gets Levitate, so it's immune to ground type attacks, so that's a second ground immunity that Mega Bee doesn't have to... So, Mega Bee doesn't have to be afraid. It can Volt Switch out, obviously it gets Hydro Pump, which hits stupidly hard. I can Will-O-Wisp. I can set up screens with this thing, which is fairly nice as well. I can run this thing physically defensive, I can run it specially defensive, I can toy around with choice options if I want. Rotom-Wash actually kind of serves a similar purpose to Landorus-Therian, except without the ability to set up hazards. It can switch out I can use Volt Switch for momentum purposes. It's got a fair amount of things it can do, even though it's kind of relatively limited to being a special attacker. Rotom-Wash is a solid addition to the team, I feel. Jumping down to my 2 tier 3 picks. The first one on the dock is, one I haven't used in quite some time, but it's one I've been dying to use again, especially since it's proven itself fairly solid when I have used it in the past. And that would be Gardevoir. Finally putting a Fairy on the board, and a Psychic type on top of that. Now, this is the first mon I've drafted that does not have any form of Volt Turn capability, but this is a solid mon I can Volt Turn into. Gardevoir is a fairly solid pick. It may not be its Mega form, so I can't just spam Pixelite Hyper Voice, but regular Gardevoir doesn't really need that. I mean, I can use Moonblast fairly solidly, I can abuse Psychic or Psyshock, I can run this thing as a Cleric or a Dual Screener if I wish. Choice Scarf Gardevoir is definitely a very solid option and a very imposing threat that could really put a lot of pressure on opposing mons. This thing is fairly specially bulky as well, so there's a lot Gardevoir actually does for my team. I have used this thing once before in draft format. It was in a league that was a long time ago and unfortunately did not last very long before it fell apart. Sad as that is to say. But, all in all, I like what Gardevoir brings to the table and the pressure it can provide for team building purposes for my opponents. As for my other tier 3, I wanted to continue my Fire, Water, Grass core, and this is the point where I'm starting to realize I do have a solid hazard setter, but I'm kind of lacking in hazard removal, and if I'm going to run Mega Bee and Volt Turn spam especially, I really need hazard removal. Solid hazard removal at that. And I found a mon that not only gives me an addition to my Fire, Water, Grass core, and it is a solid hazard remover, but it's a fairly solid option for both offensive and defensive purposes, and it also gets U-turn, so it's yet another member of the Volt Turn family I've got going on. That being the Robin Hood of Pokemon itself, Decidueye. Now, Decidueye is actually a fairly underrated mon in draft format, I feel. I have seen this thing run fairly effectively in a couple of leagues. as for the role I drafted it for. Grass Ghost is not a bad typing. Granted, it does have a fair amount of weaknesses, but Decidueye actually has a fair amount of bulk to it, so I am free to abuse U-Turn, as well as being able to defog things away. Spirit Shackle is a phenomenal move that allows me to be able to trap and slowly pick apart more defensive mons that really can't touch Decidueye, so I can keep them from going anywhere and just beat them down, which certainly works. So, that's what I feel Decidueye brings to the table. I know it's not very descriptive, but I don't know. I guess I'm just a little tired trying to record this, but I want to get this knocked out. But, all in all, I think Decidueye actually provides a fairly solid option for me. Moving on to my Tier 4 pick, I decided to go in a different direction. It's not something that learns U-Turn or Volt Switch, but this thing hits very hard. And it is one of the harder... It is definitely amongst the hardest wall breakers to prepare for in draft format. That being the ever so cuddly, if you really want to call it that, Pangoro. There is a reason Pangoro is very hard to prep for in draft format. This thing may not be fast, but it hits ridiculously hard. Not to mention, it has a fairly deep move pool, all things considered as well. So there are a number of things it can hit you with, and a number of options you can run on top of that. It gets Iron Fist, which is a very solid ability to be able to boost any of its punching moves. And if that doesn't appeal to you, there's always Mold Breaker, which nullifies opposing abilities, which is certainly a plus. This thing hits ridiculously hard being banded. You could go Life Orb, which is also a very solid option. I mean, it's hard to argue with something that has base 124 attack. That is what provides. And, I mean, if I really want to go that route, there is always the possibility that I could run a Z-Crystal on it, really catch something off guard, just to abuse that base 124 attack for even nastier purposes. Moving on to my Tier 5 pick, the last thing there before I get into my free picks. I figured I wanted another hazard setter, because, let's be honest, Lando-T is a nice hazard setter and all, but I don't want to be solely reliant on that one mon to be my hazard setter throughout the season. I have kind of learned from my mistakes, or at least I'm trying to learn from my mistakes, in the AABL, where having only one really consistent hazard setter has kind of screwed me over a bit. So, I found something that actually fits my team really nicely. It's a very solid defensive mon, it sets up rocks, it's a steel type, so I've got 2/3 of my Fairy Dragon Steel Core now. I'm talking about Steelix. Yup, the giant metal snake himself, Metal Gear Snake, however you want to refer to him. Steelix is here. As I said, it can set up stealth rocks. It has very good defenses, obviously more so geared towards the physical side, but you can EV this thing to be quite specially bulky as well. Obviously this thing hits a lot of things ridiculously hard with the likes of Heavy Slam, because it's stupidly heavy. This thing is perfect for wearing things down with moves like Toxic. Steelix does a fair amount of heavy lifting for me defensively, and it's a nice complement, I feel, to what I've already got. Granted, it is a second ground type in addition to Landorus-Therian, but I feel I have plenty of ways to maneuver around it, because they serve relatively similar roles and I can use that in relatively different capacities as well. Well, at least Steelix serves the roles Landorus-Therian can serve for me defensively, which can take some pressure off of me needing to use Lando in that role, so I can use it more offensively. Moving on to my free picks, I'm going to start with the one that cost me the most points. It was a Tier 1 pick, but I didn't just want to rely solely on Decidueye for hazard removal. I've learned I'm trying to learn my lesson from the AABL in terms of what cost me. Having only one dedicated hazard remover is not a great solution. And while Decidueye is good, there is another mon that performs the role just as well. Granted, it is a bit weak to rocks, but I can alleviate that. I am, of course, referring to Zapdos, the big bad electric bird itself. Zapdos is yet another part of my little Volturn family I've got going on here for this particular league. It's a very solid defensive mon as well. Obviously, I can use Defog to get rid of Hazard. I can Volt Switch out. I got access to moves like Heat Wave to be able to chip away at things that think they can wall Zapdos. Being able to abuse moves like very powerful Thunderbolt or even Discharge for the higher paralysis. Not to mention Zapdos' hidden ability, Static, is in fact available, so if I really want to go that route, I most certainly can. And since we're still on the topic of hazards, that's going to bring me to my next free pick. To help take a little extra pressure off of Lando T and Steelix, there is another mon I grabbed to basically serve as another hazard setting option, and if I don't want to go that route, just something that's also hit stupidly hard in general. Druddigon. Druddigon's a fairly nasty option, I'm not gonna lie, because of the many things it can do as well. It hits like a truck, especially if you're running Life Force, Life Orb Sheer Force, which it does have available to it. As I said, it can set up rocks. It completes my Fairy Steel Dragon Core, and I just have a fairly solid one at that, to be perfectly honest, for the tiers they were in. Because Druddigon was actually a tier 4 in this league. Druddigon's actually got some fairly solid defenses. Obviously, it has Rough Skin as well, so I can punish physical attackers. I can add Rocky Helmet on top of that. Another nice thing that Druddigon gives me is Glare, which is a very solid status option I can abuse if need be to maneuver around any potential problems such as ground types that normally can't be, or say Alolan Marowak or anything along those lines that normally can't be paralyzed because I can't hit them with electric moves. Druddigon can work around that, glare them, and give me a very solid way to slow things down to set up for, say, Mega Beedrill to come in and wreak havoc. My second to last free pick, I kind of got a bit of flack for, but I have my reasons for wanting to give it a shot. Even though it's never really been a solid mon in draft format, I think I can find a way to make it work. To complete my Fire Water Grass Core, I dipped into tier 3 and decided to grab Talonflame. Yup, everyone's favorite / dreaded flaming phoenix bird from the previous gen making a comeback. And I can understand why I got a lot of flack for this. Everyone is well aware that Gale Wings got a very significant nerf heading into Gen 7. It still allows a +1 priority to flying type moves, but now you can only abuse it while Talonflame is at full health, and obviously if you're using something like Brave Bird, you're not really going to get to use it that often because of the recoil. That said, Talonflame still provides me a fair amount in my opinion. It is another flying type, I've got plenty of those on this team, but it also has a fire typing. This thing does actually have a fairly solid couple of defensive options I can abuse, such as Will-O-Wisp to burn physical attackers. If I don't want to use Gale Wings, I can use the Flame Body ability, which works fairly well. The option to use Flynium Z to launch a priority supersonic Sky Strike is certainly there, and that's going to be a fun toy I'm going to love abusing. But obviously, I'm not going to tip my hand as to when I might decide to use that, because you never know. Obviously, even with the Gale Wings nerf, Talonflame is still really fast, and if you Choice Band it, it still hits stupidly hard. Not to mention there's always Sword Dancing. This thing has Flame Charge, so I can boost its speed even further if I see fit. Talonflame might not be as nerfed as people think it is. And I'm actually quite excited to see if I can make Talonflame work in this, in the draft format, especially considering everything that's working against it. My final pick, it might feel like a bit of a throwaway pick, but I still think I got a fairly solid pick out of it, dipping back into Tier 4, because there is another wall breaker that is ridiculously hard to prepare for besides Pangoro. And it was still on the board and I believe this actually was my last pick. It was still on the board, and I just couldn't resist the temptation to grab it. That being Exploud. Pangoro and Exploud are two of the toughest wall breakers to prepare for in the Draft League format, and for very good reason. Unlike, well, it may not have the versatility that Pangoro does, Exploud is one of those mons that not a whole lot really wants to take a hit from. Considering the scrappy ability, and the fact that Choice Spec's Boom Burst hits just about everything stupidly hard, even if you are especially defensive. Not to mention it can penetrate subs, Scrappy allows it to hit ghost types. There is not a lot that really wants to see this thing standing across the field from it. And if I bring this thing on more defensive options, despite to overcome the fact that Exploud is a slower mon, yeah, that's another thing where, just like Pangoro, there's a pretty good chance that I'm going to either get massive damage off on something, or pretty much pick up an easy kill. Because what wants to stand across from this thing when it starts yelling at you at supersonic decibels? So, there is my team for the SAPL. As I said, it can best be summed up as Volt Turn Spam, with some very solid defensive options, and some very powerful wall breakers at that. And this team definitely has a pretty good amount of speed going for it as well. I should also point out, since I forgot to at the beginning of this video, the SAPL is actually a Wi-Fi league, not a showdown league. So, it's going to be something a little different coming to my channel, as opposed to all the showdown leagues that I have attempted in the past, the GPL notwithstanding. So, I am very excited to be able to show off what I can do in this league, and be able to share that with all of you. And hopefully this will give me incentive to try and stay on a relatively consistent schedule as well, to try to get this channel back on track, and hopefully entice me to be able to be a little more frequent in my uploads as a whole. So with all that said, thank you guys so very much for watching. I've been Ruppy, and my Columbus Swoo and I will see you guys next time, when we begin our latest attempt to hopefully finally put our playoff curse behind us, and walk away with a league championship at long last. Take care, guys.